In the summer of 1963, a young woman kissed her boyfriend goodbye and boarded her train to go back home. When she entered her compartment, there was someone sitting already there, and so she politely smiled at them and sat next to them. And for the last time, she looked out of the window, waved her boyfriend goodbye as the train began to pull out of the station. Little did she know that the journey she had just embarked on would be the most bizarre and strangest she would ever take. As always, I will be showing images and sharing some very sensitive details about the case, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get started, my name is Andrea Scott, and if you like scary stories based on true events, then stick around because that's what I do and I'm planning to upload once a week. Now go order yourself some matcha tea and let's get into our episode. In July of 1963, two young boys named Vladimir and Oldrich were in the middle of enjoying their summer holiday break. The boys were practically inseparable and spent a lot of their days hanging out and exploring the neighborhood. And even though there was a little bit of an age gap between them, that didn't bother them at all. Oldrich, who was 9, took liking to Vladimir immediately and now saw him something like his little brother. And to Vladimir, who was only 6 years old at the time, it meant that he could now go on so much better adventures because he had this older friend who knew all the best hiding spots and the places to play at. And so that day they made a plan to go into the nearby spot where a lot of old and decommissioned trains were stationed at. As soon as the pair finished eating their lunch, they hopped onto their bikes and drove to the meeting point where they agreed to meet at. Vladimir especially was very excited by this trip because it would be his first time exploring these trains, and so he was really looking forward to exploring what's inside of them, and he was also thinking to himself that maybe he could tell all the other kids what they were up to that day and that it would make a pretty cool story. And so as soon as Vladimir saw his friend approaching him, he beamed at him and he began immediately asking how they were going to get inside of those trains. Oldrich, who had already been in one of those trains, just smirked at him and he began leading him around one of the older compartments until they stood in front of these big sliding doors. Oldrich had actually gotten into this particular train before, and so he knew that this was going to be their safest bet. But as soon as they approached the train, they immediately recognized that the door was actually slightly ajar, and so they immediately knew that they were not the only ones with the same idea that day. Later on that day, when it was approaching the boys' curfew time, both of their families began to worry a little bit, because particularly the younger Vladimir, they didn't really have the habit of coming home really late. But because it was a quite safe and quiet part of the country, both families just thought that maybe the boys just forgot about the time and they would be home in any minute. As it got progressively darker outside, the families thought that maybe something went wrong, and they ended up calling the police, who would launch a search for them. They were particularly worried that they might have gone fishing to the nearby river, which is actually one of the largest rivers in the Czech Republic, and so that they could have gotten into trouble or they could have even drowned. And so that's where the police would start their search. However, after hours and hours of searching the nearby river and the banks, they couldn't find anything. And it didn't take long until some witnesses actually came forward and they said that they saw the boys earlier that day around 6 p.m. riding around the neighborhood on their bikes. And so that the police would widen their search a little bit. 3 days after the boys were missing, one of the bikes was found dumped in a nearby swamp. The police began searching that immediate area, and soon enough, they started noticing this strange smell that was coming from a site where a bunch of old decommissioned trains were stationed. The police continued to follow this odor, and ultimately they would stand in front of this big cargo compartment. There were a lot of footprints around the cabin, and it looked like a small fire was lit there recently too, as there were several burned branches and embers nearby the entrance of the train. The train itself, however, had its doors locked with a chain, and because it seemed like the smell was coming directly inside from the train, the police retrieved this piece of metal that they used to open the chains up. And as soon as they did, they slid the doors open and immediately were hit with this vile stench pouring out of the belly of the train. Now, if you're still with me, then I wanted to ask you a small favor. I'm still growing my subscribers base, so it would really mean a lot to me if you joined us and tune in for every time a new episode is released. So far, people have been extremely supportive and motivating, so I would really love to have the opportunity to bring even more content to wider audiences. So if you want to see more, then please do subscribe, and let's get back into our story. The officers didn't hesitate at all, and they climbed into the train, but because it was quite dark inside of it, they had to light up their torches to be able to see around. And because there were so many flies about, they knew that what they were about to find was not going to be pleasant. They ultimately would come to a stop in front of what looked like a bunk bed, and what they saw made them completely and utterly sick. Lying on the floor next to the bunk bed was a small, lifeless body that was lying in its own pool of blood. And as the officers took a few more steps into the compartment, they saw that several meters away from this first body was lying yet another one. Both victims' torsos had been cut open with something sharp, and it looked as if some of their innards were missing. The officers were particularly taken back by the brutality of the scene, because there were blood splatters everywhere on the bed, on the walls, and on the ceilings as well. And so they were sickened by the thought of how horrible the last few moments of these two young victims' lives must have been. The police immediately began collecting all the evidence they could find, and surprisingly, there were actually a lot of fingerprints and footprints found about. So it looked like the killer, all the killers, did not try to conceal any of their movements whatsoever. The police would also find a small axe and a sharp knife, and since both of the bodies were cut up and also had deep marks on their heads, it was guessed that these two items could have been the murder weapons. In the meantime, the two bodies were transported to a local morgue where more evidence, including semen, was collected. It had also been confirmed that both of the victims had their kidneys missing, as well as a heart and a spleen. And to the great dismay of the families of the two boys that had been missing for the last few days, it was determined that the two bodies indeed belonged to Vladimir and Oldrich. However, as so much evidence presented itself, the hope of catching whoever was responsible for these murders was really high. The police put together a profile of the killer, and they were particularly interested in speaking to people with well-known mental disorders because of how brutal the act was. And because the killer must have been drenched in blood, dry cleaner companies were also notified, and so a statewide hunt for this killer began. The most important piece of evidence was of course the fingerprints, but because it was 1963, the test would not come back instantaneously, and it would take several days to clear. About a week after the murders, a local farmer decided to plow his field that had not been harvested yet. And so that morning he woke up at 5 o'clock, made himself a small breakfast and a coffee, and decided to head out for the day. He climbed into his tractor, turned it on, and began the work. As he was going around the field in a very methodical movement, so not to miss any of the part of the field, he suddenly felt that something was jamming the giant steel plates that now have stopped moving. Now, if you've never seen this machine, these plates can vary in sizes, but they are always razor sharp because they have to cut through to produce. And as they turn, everything gets cut up and turned over as they spin. And as it would turn out, the very thing that was wedging these giant plates was actually a body of a man. When the workers saw how badly the man appeared to be hurt, he didn't hesitate at all and ran back into his house, where he would call the ambulance and they would rush back to the scene immediately. The ambulance took the man into the nearby hospital, and as soon as his wounds were treated and he was out of the immediate danger, a few police officers poured into the room and placed him under arrest. It would turn out that the fingerprints collected at the murder scene of the two boys were matched to this man named Josef Kulík, who was known to have committed several crimes in his past. As part of his search, a notebook was actually found in his jacket, and that contained a lot of details about his past crimes, as well as information about the murder of the two boys. However, as Kulík was now working as a soldier of the Soviet army, several officials were trying to keep this case quiet and away from the public eye. Police would finally get to interrogate Kulík themselves, and here is a reconstruction of what he had confessed to committing. Kulík, whose mother died when he was very young, grew up with a very abusive father. And because he had practically zero idea of what good and bad behaviors were, because he didn't really have any role models, he began committing petty crimes throughout his childhood. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison because he had tried committing a murder, and while he was in jail, he began having sexual intercourse with his male inmates. Kulík actually confessed that he had never been with a woman, and that all of his sexual activity was actually just with either of his inmates, his victims, or his very own father. And when he was finally released, he was over 30 years old, and because he had nowhere really to go, he decided to join the military service. And so on the afternoon of July 29, 1963, he was returning to his station. But because he fell asleep on the train, he actually missed his stop and only woke up at the very last station because he was asked to disembark the train. And not really knowing what to do next, he began walking past the old tracks where no trains would run on anymore, until he got to this clearing where several old discontinued machines were stationed. And so Kulík thought that maybe he could spend the night in one of the cabins over there and just wait for the train to take him back to the station next day. And so he gained access to one of the compartments by breaking in, and to his luck, he found that there was even a bunk bed that he could sleep on. It wasn't much later when Kulík heard a couple of voices coming from outside of the train. He could recognize that they probably belonged to two young boys, and he got very excited about this idea. He quickly moved towards the sliding door and pulled it even farther apart, and sure enough, outside there were standing two young boys looking very puzzled at him. Kulík, thinking very quickly on his feet, reassured them that they were in no trouble whatsoever by being there, and even asked them if they actually wanted to come in and play with him because he too liked trains very much. And since the boys really wanted to explore these trains, they agreed and they hopped in and began following Kulík inside of the train. There, Kulík grabbed an axe that he had only found a couple of minutes earlier inside of the train, and with several fast movements aimed for the older boy's head. Oldřich, who was completely stunned by this, he didn't really know what was happening, and so he couldn't really protect himself. And as he was struck for the third time, he lifelessly fell to the ground dead. Vladimír, who was further down the train, he could hear the commotion behind him, and so he quickly turned around and saw what was happening to his friend. He could see that Oldřich was now lying on the floor, and there was a dark liquid pouring outside of his head. Vladimír tried running away, but as he was passing Oldřich's body, he slipped on the pool of blood. And in that moment, Kulík actually grabbed him by the arm and swung for his head with the axe that he was still holding. And Vladimír screamed out in pain, but just like his friend Oldřich, there was nothing he could have done to prevent this. And so with a couple of more blows to his head, he too collapsed on the floor dead. Kulík, who was beyond excited by his actions, threw the axe away and picked up a small knife. There he kneeled over the two bodies of the boys, and with several long and deep cuts, he removed his kidneys, their heart, and his spleen. He wrapped these into a handkerchief and placed them next to the bodies, and before he did anything else, he began masturbating over the boys. But this crime was far from being over. When Kulík finished with his victims inside of the train, he hopped out and aimed for the local cemetery. There he stole some branches and flowers that had been left by people on the graves of their loved ones. And when he brought these back, he squatted in front of the train and started making a small fire. Then he climbed back into the train, retrieved the innards that were still wrapped in their handkerchief, and with his still bloodied knife, he began cutting them up into smaller pieces. He then placed these pieces over the fire to cook, and eventually he would also eat them. After this, he chained the train door shut and ran away. A couple of days later, he realized he was actually being hunted for, and so he tried hiding in that field. But of course, he was run over, brought to the hospital, and eventually even interrogated by the police. For his heinous crimes, Kulík would be sentenced to death by hanging, which would be carried out on the 7th of February 1964 in Prague State Prison Pankráč. Today, the spot where the two boys had been found is remembered by a spot with a small gravestone. It wasn't until 2022 when now an elderly woman named Dagmar contacted the local newspapers about an article that they had printed about Kulík again. She remembered this incident that happened to her years and years ago when she was returning home from her then boyfriend. She recalled sitting next to this young and handsome soldier who made a point of talking to her during the entire trip. He was particularly interested in what she was studying and where. And when she told him, the soldier took out a piece of paper and wrote a man's name on it. And he said that this was a relative of his. He gave Dagmar that piece of paper and he asked whether she had knew him because he actually lived around where she studied. But she said no, she didn't know him, and the soldier just shrugged it off. And so what started off as a pleasant conversation was now beginning to be a bit more creepy and progressively more and more disturbing. The soldier would ultimately describe a murder of 2 boys that allegedly happened earlier that week. According to the soldier, these 2 boys were lured into a cabin in the woods where they would be stunned and left for 3 days. And after that, they would be wheeled over to an old train where they would ultimately be killed. The woman was obviously horrified by hearing all of this, and so she asked the man how did he know that this had happened, to which he replied he of course read it in the newspapers. When Dagmar got home later on that day, all she could think of was that strange soldier and the even stranger story that he had told her. And so she began scanning all the newspapers that she could lay her hands on, but there was no mention of these murders whatsoever. And even her friends and family hadn't heard of any of this themselves. A few days later, the papers would print out a story of the 2 missing boys, and ultimately everybody would learn about their murder as well. The most horrific moment for Dagmar was still to come, however. A few months later, when she was out with a couple of her friends just walking around the town, they passed an elderly man. And this man wasn't really trying to make a conversation with them, he was actually trying to just blend in and not attract any attention whatsoever. However, one of her friends recognized this man, and he said that he was surprised to see him about because he was actually a relative of the soldier who was now awaiting his death sentence by killing the 2 young boys. The friend also mentioned the elderly man's name, and this is when the penny dropped for Dagmar. This was the same name that the soldier all those years ago written out on that small piece of paper and gave to her. And so Dagmar now finally understood that the soldier did not read about the murders in the newspapers. He was actually the killer, and she was traveling next to him and lived to tell the tale. And so guys, this brings us to the end of our story. Thank you very much for joining in. I'll see you very soon with a brand new episode. Until next time.